So Bret, you were recently on Eric's podcast, The Portal, for an episode called All Our Mice Are Broken, which is a long story, really fascinating. I've heard a lot of people say it was one of the most fascinating podcasts they've ever heard. It's a detective story. It's a story that has kind of huge ramifications for medical testing, and it was really, really well told, and it also has a lot of really interesting dynamics between you and Eric as well. Commiserations.
Thank you.
I really urge anyone to go away and listen to that, because we don't want to recap the whole story here. But I'd love to hear what has happened since, whether there's been any, because one of the other questions that it brings up is what stories are being covered by and are registering in sort of the mainstream, and which ones are sort of disappearing without trace, and why they might be disappearing without trace. What Eric's called the DISC, the Distributed Information Suppression Complex.
Yeah.
Maybe we could talk about like what effect it's had, and just sort of without summarizing the whole story, why this is significant.
So the important piece of the story from the perspective of your audience and the rest of us is that when I was a graduate student, I was working on a question that involved cancer, senescence, and evolution. And I stumbled on a result in the literature that I had to grapple with that didn't fit with my hypothesis or anything else. And as I wrestled with it, the conclusion was that all mice, or in some cases all rodents, were thought to have long telomeres. Telomeres are repetitive DNA sequences at the ends of chromosomes, and at the point that I was doing this work in the late 90s, they were understood to shorten every time a cell divided. So when a cell divided its DNA to copy it, a little bit of the telomere was lost each time, and there comes a point at which a cell has a small enough set of repeats in its telomere that it no longer divides. I was working on the hypothesis that these shortening events were actually a protection against tumors and cancer, and that the downside of that system of cancer protection was that our tissues couldn't repair themselves indefinitely, and we grew old and feeble with age and ultimately die. The problem was that with the conclusion that all mice have ultra-long telomeres, this could not be made sensible, because mice have short lives, and if they have telomeres that are 10 times as long as people, they should have the ability to replace their tissues, and they should be very long-lived. So the podcast recounts the story of my increasing suspicion that there was something wrong with the conclusion that all mice have long telomeres, and my contacting a researcher, Carol Greider, who then tested that hypothesis with her graduate student at the time, Mike Heeman, and they discovered that, in fact, mice, that is to say, wild mice, don't have long telomeres, and that it's only lab mice that do have long telomeres, as I had predicted. The most important outgrowth of that conclusion is that there's a problem in our drug safety system, because our drug safety system utilizes laboratory rodents, especially mice, to test the safety of drugs before they're ever tested on humans. Our mice, which have been altered by the environment and the laboratory breeding colonies from which laboratories get them, our mice have been altered by evolutionary forces in those colonies so that they have effectively an infinite capacity to replace damaged tissue and an incredibly extreme vulnerability to cancer. In other words, they eventually get cancer and their tissues do not grow old, right? Because their telomeres are so long. When you use those animals in order to test a new drug, to see whether it would be safe to give them to people, you get a paradoxical effect. Or at least the hypothesis suggests that the effect should be that the damage that is done to those mice by these drugs, unless it is so extreme in the moment that it kills them outright, will not be harmful to them, because mice, unlike us, can replace their tissues indefinitely. And in fact, because these mice seem to all get cancer if you let them live long enough, a poisonous drug may actually extend their lives because it functions as a kind of chemotherapy. So the not so funny joke told in chemotherapy wards is that the whole purpose of chemotherapy is to kill the tumor faster than you kill the patient, right? Tumors are more vulnerable than regular tissues because their DNA is constantly dividing, and when DNA is dividing, it is vulnerable in a way that DNA that is paired is not. And so these mice are suffering from an unusual cancer load, and a poisonous drug that actually damages cells that are vulnerable will actually interrupt their cancer's ability to grow, and so they may actually live longer than their non-drug counterparts. In any case, though, the result of this is that you will administer drugs in high doses to mice to see whether or not they are poisonous. Mice will not respond the way people do because of their unusual telomeres, which have evolved to be long in the laboratory colonies. And then when you release the drug into the human population, these toxins will do damage in our bodies, which will be particularly visible when it affects the heart, because the heart has a low capacity for cellular repair, and when the heart fails, it's very noticeable. So the idea is that something like Vioxx, which turned out to be destructive of heart tissue, was released into the public because our mechanism for testing whether it would be safe in mice had failed us. There are quite a number of other drugs that have shown the same pattern. We thought they were safe. They were then released. They turn out to do heart damage. They're pulled from the market, or warnings are appended to them. So the question is, have we made an error where something about our laboratory environments is creating mice that make drugs look much safer than they actually are, and causing us actually to suffer pharmaceutical harm that is unnecessary? You asked what the outgrowth of this podcast had been. There was tremendous interest in it online, on YouTube and on other social media outlets. And bizarrely, there's been no reaction from anybody in the academy or in the press, in the mainstream press.
There's some very strange thing where nobody seems to want to engage the issue that there was a first principles prediction coming from evolutionary theory that seems to have radical implications, both for our understanding of death and for the way in which we use the mouse model to test all sorts of things. The mind reels. I can't fathom that, given the amount of interest in this story, and this video has just soared up the charts. It's now over 100,000 views. There must be 250,000 downloads, that came very quickly. Many people have heard it. And the interesting thing is how interested everyone is in the story, and how the interest is least in the place that you would expect it most. I would imagine if this was a wrong story, we would be hearing nothing but chortling from the molecular biology community telling us how badly we've understood what in fact is going on. Or I would want to understand from the news media, tell me, why is this uninteresting to you? I should say that I've named these sorts of stories anti-interesting. An anti-interesting story isn't really uninteresting. The more riveting the anti-interesting story gets, the less interest there is from the official channels.
And why do you think that's the response from journalism? Or let's start from molecular biology. Why do you think there's that response from molecular biology or from the scientific community?
Well, let's think about it. What if you had 20 years of studies that were built around a mouse model which was known to be broken? And that, in fact, you had people who were trying to say that the mouse model might be broken, and we need to have a discussion about this immediately. And the community had decided that it didn't want to introduce the idea that this might have far-reaching implications. Perhaps many results that we have based on the use of these mice are off. You could have 1,000 strains, but if they share a common breeding protocol, You might have a situation by which all of those strains are affected because they're all subject to the same etiology, that the breeding rotation is in fact an evolutionary environment, and that telomeres adapt rapidly, unlike protein coding regions. So my belief is that if you really don't want to shake up your own, I mean, this is the typical story. If you don't have the ability to shake up your own institution, you tend to want to throw these things under the rug and hope that nobody notices. With respect to journalism, I don't know. I mean, journalists have gotten very bizarre. You talk to a lot of them, they're very excited about the story, so that my experience with journalists is that you still have fresh faces who hear something and they'll tell you, oh, this is fascinating, it's fantastic, I got to run it down, I'm getting all these partial results. And then very often you get this weird phone call, which is like, my editor said to stop working on it. Well, why? They said it wasn't of any interest. Well, it might involve drug testing. It might involve why we die. How could you say that this isn't interesting? Well, that's what he said. He said it wasn't interesting to enough people. Too complicated. You're like, are you kidding me? I mean, there's just no way of telling this, David. I'm getting sort of almost fatigued having to go through it. Something has gone terribly wrong with journalism, and I just don't know of anybody who's not sensing that.
I guess trying to understand why it happened from the sort of information side, from the journalism side. Journalism works by dedicated, or a story like this would work, but through a dedicated investigative journalist who's willing to sort of chase it down, to stake sort of to a lot of time and a lot of energy in doing it. So it kind of, I certainly feel that one of the things that's happened in journalism, it's become much more of an information processing thing rather than an information sourcing thing. Like cutbacks in the numbers of journalists, and like probably the skill level of journalists who used to kind of in the 70s use the phone book, make calls themselves, is like those skills I think have definitely atrophied to a degree.
Look, I have to be careful about it. If I wasn't careful about it, this is a very simple story.
Yeah.
Maybe we released a lot of bad mice, and that now we've got health implications from the fact that our mice model is all screwed up, and that we had people who didn't want to give credit where credit was due. And so we didn't get the hypothesis that explained what the potential ramifications are. Full stop.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody may have figured out why we die. Is that of any interest to you? Is it too complicated? I don't buy any of this. If you're smart enough to watch Game of Thrones or The Sopranos, you're smart enough to follow this story. If you really can't follow more than one plot line at a time, and you need everything in all caps and really big type, then maybe you're not the target audience for this. But as long as people subscribe to the, The Economist or the Times, it would appear, if we don't have a world that's smart enough to follow this story, we've got a lot bigger problems than telomeres. I don't think this is very difficult. And I'll be honest, I think that these excuses about budgets are absurd. I could do this in my spare time if I wasn't actually a participant in the story.
Just to summarize, like for people who, as soon as you say the word telomere, start to kind of glaze over and like are really struggling to follow the story, which I think many of us are, like the ins and outs of it. Why is this so significant?
Well, it depends what you mean by this. There are two thises. There's what goes on in a normal mammal with respect to telomere senescence and cancer. And then there's what happened in the scientific study of telomeres. Those are two very distinct stories. And I really wish that we could talk about the scientific story in isolation from the big science story, because the big science story is a very different, it's about human failings more than anything else, whereas the scientific story is an absolutely fascinating story that explains who we are and why we're built the way we are, and it really needs to be more broadly understood. The problem is you can't really understand the scientific story unless you understand how the human story was preventing it from emerging. The two stories have become intertwined in a way that they're almost impossible to disentangle. And so anyway, that's one of the things that emerged on this podcast. The import of the scientific story is we do not understand that we are the beneficiaries of a system that very almost ideally balances two conflicting deadly hazards. One hazard is tumors, and the other is wearing out. We have a system in which we don't have to wear out because our tissues can replace themselves. But if you let that system do its own thing, then every cell, almost every cell in your body is in danger of turning into a tumor that will kill you. If you correct for the problem of tumors that can run away and crowd out vital organs, then you create a limit on the amount of tissue repair you can do. And understanding that human beings are actually extremely well built in this regard. We are the longest lived terrestrial mammal by far as a result of the fact that this system has been built to give us very long lives. So the entire question about extending maximum human lifespans should happen in this context. We've had our lifespans radically extended since our branching point with other mammals, right? Natural selection has already worked on this puzzle, and it has given us a very effective adaptive balance between these two hazards. You can definitely have tissues that replace themselves better, but you'll have more cancer risk, right? And you can definitely have less cancer risk, but then you'll have tissues that don't replace themselves very effectively. And the question is, could we adaptively shift that balance a little bit? We could. Would it be desirable? There are even scenarios in which it might be. For example, if we got very, very good at spotting tumors when they had just started, right? Well, then you might be willing to have more tumors start and then to address them surgically in exchange for tissues that age less quickly. That's conceivable. We could do that. And, if that's what we're going to do, we should pursue it. But we should not pretend that what we are pursuing is an end to human aging, because that's not going to happen, right? It can't happen. So that's the scientific upshot. The social upshot, the big science upshot is that the market has interfaced with scientific study in ways that are absolutely devastating. The way that the mouse telomere got extended had to do with market forces that rewarded the production of mice at a very rapid rate. In order to produce mice at a very rapid rate, a decision was made to breed only young animals, and breeding only young animals had a dramatic selective effect in the colonies, it would appear. That was one way in which the market interfaced badly with the story. The other way it seems to interface badly with the story has to do with flourishing in an academic environment by keeping quiet with respect to hazards like this. And it had to do with the scientific apparatus serving the interests of potentially the pharmaceutical industry at the expense of the public. I'm pretty sure the pharmaceutical industry did not know that the mice were broken in a way that biased drugs in the direction of looking safe until I pointed it out. However, after that point, they did know, and they had a question. Did they want to solve the problem at some large financial cost to their industry, or did they want to sweep it under the rug? I have no idea whether pharmaceutical companies have actually taken action, but what I do know is that the system is sensitive to the kind of money that the pharmaceutical industry brings to bear, and that it would not be surprising if they are functioning as the ghost in the machine that prevents this story from ever emerging.